The Summer I Met David, Part 7, Finale, by the lovely Freya. The sun was dying. Strangled rays of light touched the horizon. Colours splashed along evening sky as the moon began to peek into view. Sunlight danced off the pointed edges of the glass that jutted from the windowsills and lay discarded upon the floor. The discontented grunts of the pigs outside filtered through the broken windows and echoed through the home. A cool breeze carried with it the smell of hogs and straw. Hooves clip-clopped on the wood of the porch. I focused on each of these details separately as I tried to ignore the withering screams of my brother as he thrashed in the chair. I looked away as the tall, skinny man dashed out the room, my mother on his heels, mumbling something about likely needing stitches. I kept my eyes off Jack as he silently cried. He crouched down, his hands buried in his hair, as he watched his baby brother fight the demon inside him. If I kept my eyes on the window, if I focused on the pigs and the breeze and the dying light, then I didn't have to think about what was happening. Father Brown began to scream something, but I was doing everything in my power to ignore it. My fingers absently trailed through Joey's thin hair as I tried desperately to quell his despondent wails. He squirmed in my grasp, throwing his body this way and that. He kicked the ground and demanded that I let him go. My arms held steadfast, but to this day, I don't know how. As I was jostled from side to side with my brother's struggle, I felt distant, detached, almost as though I weren't there at all, as if every piece of me that wasn't my physical body was somewhere else. I stayed in the wonderfully murky place of peace for as long as I could. It wasn't until the ground beneath me began to quake and the things on the shelves began to fall and shatter upon the ground that I returned, kicking and screaming, to the present. Father Brown was standing over my screaming brother, a cross in his hand as he shouted over my crazed sibling. Jim, who had once been as bronze as Jack, was now ashen and grey. His skin had turned a sickly sort of pasty colour. His lips were blue. His eyes shone with a deep rage that set my teeth on edge. "Give me your name and the time of your departure," the father shouted, one hand firmly grasping Jim's shoulder, the other held across like a weapon in front of his face. Jim threw his head back, and low, choked, ragged laugh trickled from between his parted lips. The father's hand shot out, taking Jim by the chin. He pulled his head back down so Jim was forced to look at him. He shoved the cross into his face. "Look at me!" Father Brown shouted. Jim only laughed, his eyes diverted and landed squarely on me. My stomach dropped, ice rolled through my veins.
Me,
Jim repeated, the voice no longer his own. It was deep, sounding almost as though it had been slowed. Father Brown's grip tightened. He wrenched his head back so he had no choice but to look at him. "Your name, devil! Give me your name! It is God who commands you! Give me your name!" Jim's smile disappeared, leaving only hostile revulsion in its wake. His nose crinkled, his lip curled, his eyes grew cold. He huffed through gritted teeth, spittle flying out of his mouth and onto the father. "I've burned down a dozen homes," he warned. The stove burners began to glow. Heat radiated off of them. "I'll burn this one to the ground too. I'll watch the skin melt from your bones, and I'll relish in the fact that it will be nothing compared to hellfire." The door slammed shut, and the locks clicked. My father rushed over to the stove, turning them off one by one. And one by one, they turned themselves back on. Father Brown leaned further in as he hissed the words into the ear of the demon. "I command you, unclean spirit, whoever you are, along with your minions now attacking the servant of God, Jim began to twitch, his eyes slamming shut in agony as he writhed, trying to get away. By the mysteries of the incarnation, passion, resurrection, and ascension of our Lord Jesus Christ, by the descent of the Holy Spirit, by the coming of our Lord for judgment, that you tell me by some sign your name. No names! Jim hissed, his eyes bleeding to black. No names. Father Brown continued, his grip growing tighter as he leaned into my brother. The house vibrated as Jim cried out and fought against the restraints. And the day and hour of your departure, I command you, moreover, to obey me to the letter. Jim began to snap wildly at the air, trying to catch Father Brown's flesh between his teeth, but to no avail. He screwed away the pain, his muscles tensed, his back bowed. I, who am a minister of God despite my unworthiness, nor shall you be emboldened to harm in any way this creature of God, or the bystanders, or any of their possessions. Jack stumbled, jerking weirdly, and nearly falling to the ground. His hand went to his neck, which was now bare. The silver cross necklace he'd been wearing had been torn from his person by an invisible force. The cross, upside down, stuck to the wall. The pigs outside began to squeal. Father Brown took a handful of Jim's hair and wrenched his head backwards. His face lingered just inches away from Jim's. Depart then, transgressor. Depart, seducer, full of lies and cunning, foe of virtue, persecutor of the innocent. Give place, abominable creature. Give way, you monster. Give way to Christ, in whom you found none of your works. For he has already stripped you of your powers and laid waste your kingdom, bound you prisoner and plundered your weapons. He has cast you forth into the outer darkness, where everlasting ruin awaits you and your abettors. Your name! Tell me your name! God commands you, tell me your name! Jim screamed, but instead of the dark, growling voice I'd come to expect from his body, it was sharp and nasally. It tugged at my heart. It made me want to run to him. It was Jim's voice. He shrieked over and over again. Tears began to pour down his cheeks, his eyes widened, moving rapidly in search of anyone but the priest, who lingered above just him. His body began to quake. I'm sorry. Please stop. He pleaded with the priest. Please stop. Please. He began to sob. His eyes were filled with both confusion and terror as he realized the man above him wasn't about to let him go. Jim's chest began to fall and rise at an alarming rate. Sweat beaded along his brow. Make it stop! He pleaded. Please! Please, Dad! He tried to writhe off Father Brown's grasp to search for our father, but the priest held on too tightly. Dad! Where are you? Dad! Please help! He winced in pain as Father Brown tightened his grip and forced him again to look at him. Make him stop! It hurts! He sobbed pathetically. It hurts! Make him stop! My father managed to turn all the burners off and was now looking at his son in absolute horror. He rushed to his side as his child pleaded with him to make the pain go away. Father Brown's arm shot out, though his eyes never left my brother. Stay back, he commanded. Stay back! It's not Jim. My father's features crumbled. Confusion and sadness played in his eyes. What do you mean? My father asked, his voice sounding hollow and distant. He's my son. That's my son you're torturing. Jim's features were caked with terror. His jaw trembled, his body shook. Wide eyes darted from the priest above him to his father. It's me, he swore. It's me! I'm Jim! Please, Father! Please let me go! No! Father Brown shouted, cold eyes staring into the face of the child below him. He motioned to the wall where the cross still hung, upside down. It isn't. A rage-filled roar stirred within Jim's chest. The pigs outside began to squeal and stomp. Useless! He growled. Fucking useless! Failure of a father! Let me go! Let me go! My father stumbled back, his eyes wide and his hands trembling. He took 3 steps back before bending over and sucking in a deep breath. Jack clasped a hand against his shoulder and bent down to whisper something to him that I couldn't hear. The father pressed his cross against Jim's temple. The beast writhed and screamed. He hurled insults and berated everyone in the room, but Father Brown shouted a prayer above his words nonetheless. At the end of it all, he opened the shiny vial and dumped its contents atop Jim's head. "Your name!" Father Brown shouted. "Give me your name!" Jim threw his head back. His eyes rolled into his head. His body trembled and shook. Foam poured from between his lips. "Heligos!" he shouted, a strangled sort of noise. "Heligos! Heligos! Heligos! Heligos!" "Heligos!" Father Brown seethed, his hands finding Jim's face as he pulled him down and stared into the face of the beast. "I see you, Heligos. God sees you. I command you in the name of the Almighty Father, in the name of His Son and our Savior Jesus Christ, that you depart this servant of God. I command you to leave Jeremy Isaac. I command you to depart. Leave!" he shouted. With all the deafening noise around, I'd hardly noticed Joey's desperate cries as he buried his face into my shoulder. But suddenly, with the last word of the father's prayer, everything went silent. The pigs ceased their cries and their movement. Jim no longer shouted or growled. His body went very still, back still bowed against the tape that kept him in place. Jim's features went slack. His chin rested against his chest. He was contorted in an odd sort of way that burned holes in my memory. His eyes had rolled back into his head, only the whites were showing. The seconds ticked by, and for a long time, Joey's crying and the hard breathing of the father was the only noise in the room. The necklace fell to the ground with a metallic clank. A deafening shriek tore from Jim's chest. He shook, he thrashed, he contorted. And then he fell, slumping in the chair, entirely motionless. Father Brown bent down, his forehead touching Jim's as he prayed for him. With shaking hands and tears in their eyes, my father and Jack freed Jim. My father carried him, as though he were only a toddler, as we hurried through the front door and waded through a sea of pigs to the car. My mother sat beside Jim the whole ride to the hospital, keeping a close eye on his heart rate and making sure he was still breathing. Jack was given stitches and sent on his way, while Jim was admitted into the hospital and kept for nearly a week. The prolonged fever, combined with the physical strain of the exorcism, had left him weak and ill. Concerns of brain damage were expressed. I'd never been so relieved when all his cognitive and physical tests came back normal. For the next 6 weeks, we stayed with Father Brown. Jim joined us on the second week. Despite him not suffering any long-term physical repercussions from the event, he didn't escape unscathed. It would seem that the psychological damage done was unending. Night terrors became his new reality. They were frequent, nearly every day, sometimes multiple times a day. He began to wet his bed. He refused to be alone, even for just a moment or two. He'd jump at every small sound and disturbance. He hardly did anything but sit in front of the television. But even then, what he viewed was very limited. Anything more mature than Disney movies and I Love Lucy reruns were too much for him to handle. He began to shake and rock in his place, mumbling something about not wanting to be invaded again. It was nearing the end of the third week that my father began going back to the home to fix things. Each night he'd return, telling us that it had been quiet, but there had been no sign of David anywhere. Father Brown assured us that we'd never ever face Heligos again, that he'd been cast down into the depths of hell. We believed him, and nearly 2 months after the exorcism, we moved back into the home. Things were clunky and hard at first. We all slept in the living room, each of us too frightened to sleep anywhere else. The upstairs went entirely unused, by everyone but Joey, who frequently played in his room. We didn't allow it at first, but as we slowly began to accept that David was gone, we started allowing him to go up and play with his toys. Jim hated even being near the staircase, and often set up blockades when Joey wasn't up there. All of us knew that a simple wall made of inn tables, pillows and blankets would never keep David at bay. Hell, it hardly kept Joey out. But none of us pointed this out. We let him cope in whatever way he could. My father and mother started making preparations to sell the home. The housing market had tanked. Our real estate agent tried to convince my parents to put the move on hold for a few years, until the market bounced back. She warned that even with the massive amount of land we were offering with the home, it was likely we'd get less than 3/4 of our asking price. My parents didn't care. They wanted out. We all did. We showed the home to several prospective buyers. 3 times we thought we'd sold it, and all 3 times, the buyer backed out. 2 of them said they had a sinking feeling about it. Another said the property itself made him feel nervous. This did nothing to calm our nerves. The months dragged on. The hot, sticky months were behind us as we headed into winter. The trees were bare, and the grass was a dead brown sort of colour. We hadn't gotten snow in nearly a decade. My father swore that we might that year. I couldn't deny that I was excited. I'd never seen snow before. At least, not in real life anyway. My parents hoped that perhaps the cool weather would stifle some of the smell from the pigs and encourage buyers. We had no such luck. It was 3 days before Christmas. The morning was crisp and cold. I started my day the same way I had for the past 6 weeks. I pulled on a high top, pink swampers, and followed my father, Jack, Jim and Johnny outside. I'd started helping the boys on the farm, and I was quite proud of myself for it. With me gone from the home in the mornings, Mom was left to do the indoor chores with Joey. But it was little help, and often lost interest within the first few minutes. My mother never pushed him, the way she had the rest of us, to stay on task. Looking back, I'm sure she was driven by guilt. So, while she was scrubbing away dishes or wiped down walls, Joey could often be found playing in his room, by himself. Sometimes I'd hear him laugh from the window upstairs as he threw a ball against his wall or rolled his trucks across his floor. He was good at occupying himself, a trait that my mother rather appreciated, since none of us had it as children. I followed behind my line of siblings and waited for my father to tell me what I'd be doing. Most of the time, I was paired with Jim, since Johnny still had a nasty habit of knocking me down, or trying to make me cry every chance he got. Today was no different. Dad told Jim and I to feed the pigs, so Jack mixed together feed and retrieved the buckets. I'd gained a good amount of muscle in the past several weeks. I no longer struggled with the filled buckets as I carried it down to the last pen, and emptied it into the large feeder. Jim and I silently passed one another time and time again, as we slowly filled every feeder in the barn. Soon enough, we were done, and ready to head off to the second barn, where nursing stoves and piglets were kept. Our swampers, caked with brown mud, kicked up dirt as Jim and I made our way down the driveway, a little ways away further from the home. This was my favourite part of the day, partly because I got to see the cows, and partly because Joey's window faced the barn. He'd always slap the glass and call cheerfully to me as we passed. I thought it was the cutest thing. Most mornings I would spend several minutes waving back to him and making silly faces. I'd just reached the barn door, my fingers grasping the cool metal, when the sound of a window opening drew my attention away. Joey was notorious for opening the windows to shout hellos down to us, but it was midwinter and positively freezing. The heat was on in the house, and I knew damn well that Dad or Mom would swat him for doing it. I turned around just as he called the cheerful, "Hi, Jasmine." "Joseph, Lucas, you close that." My voice died down, caught in my throat. My eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought my heart had stopped. I wanted to scream, or cry, or point, or do something to get Jim's attention and show him what was happening. But I was frozen in my place, unable to move. Jim paused, concern etched along his brow as he stared at me. "Jazz?" Jim asked, waving a hand in front of my face. I wanted to react. I wanted to tell him to turn around. Internally, I was screaming for him to look up, but my lips refused to obey. So instead, I stared, my mouth agape, and fear scrawled across my features. "Earth Jasmine, you okay?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. Finally, he turned to follow my line of sight. His body stiffened, The familiar sour smell of urine flooded my senses. The putrid liquid splashed along Jim's pants and trailed down his pant leg. I could hear a puddle in his boot. He was the first of us to manage to speak. It was just a choked sort of noise that I think was supposed to be no. Standing right behind Joey, eyeless, dressed in a red shirt and jeans, was David. His lips turned up into a terrible smile. Joey's features crumbled as he watched us in complete confusion. I couldn't peel my eyes away from the window as my baby brother spun around. I could see fear radiate off him, even with his back to me. He shrank away from the beast, trying to make himself as small as possible. David pushed him, sending him through the screen of the window and hurtling toward the earth. Jim and I ran, but we weren't nearly fast enough. Joey tumbled through the sky and landed on his back with a sickening thud. As we sprinted closer to him, I watched his eyes peel open and shut, and his head wobble from side to side as he opened his mouth time and time again to try to scream. No sound came out, but tears streamed down his face all the same. I don't think I'll ever get that image out of my head. I knelt down beside Joey, trying to remember what to do, but I was drawing a blank. Do I move him? Or keep him still? I didn't know. My heart pounded against my chest, and finally I found my voice. I shrieked, time and time again, through heavy sobs. Joey jumped with each of my wails, his tiny eyes opening only to shut again. Jack and my father were at my side in an instant. They shouted questions, but I couldn't answer. All I could manage were the same ear-piercing screams. Jim pointed upwards. Jack's head tilted, eyes stationed upon the window. Anger rolled over him as he caught sight of David, who stood in the window, a smug smile plastered on his lips. "Mom!" Jim shrieked. I wasn't sure if he was calling her out to help with Joey, or if he was shouting for her because he was afraid of what David might do. The rest of the details are all a little blurry. Joey wasn't moving. Everyone was hysterical. Jack dialed 911. I don't remember what happened in the nearly half an hour it took for 911 to get to us. Only that my father sat next to my brother the whole time, this massive hand covering Joey's. My mother cried and kept a hand on his chest, making sure that he was still breathing. The men came and lifted him up on a stretcher. Mom and Dad rode in the ambulance while Jack drove us to the hospital to meet them. I remember the car being filled with silence, occasionally shattered by a heavy sob. I remember Jim looking out the window with the 1,000-yard stare of a child who had seen too much. I remember feeling entirely responsible, and Johnny's piercing glares only confirmed that for me. I remember feeling entirely responsible, and Johnny's piercing glares only confirmed that for me. Joey underwent 9 surgeries, and stayed in the hospital for nearly a solid month. Several internal organs had ruptured, and he'd shattered multiple bones. He never walked again. His spine had been broken in 4 places. We never returned to the home. We stayed with Father Brown for 6 months while we closed on the house. My father said he informed the new owners of the strange happenings, and they assured him they weren't superstitious. To this day, I don't know if that's true or not. I also know I'll never go back there to find out. We left, moving north, putting as much of the country between us and the home as we could. For the next 12 years, I lived with my parents in the small home they bought with the money we'd made off the house. 21 years later, our family had recovered from our experience with David. Jack went to school and became a preacher. He married a lovely woman, and together, they had 2 children. This winter they'll be welcoming their first grandchild into the world. Jim moved to California in his early 20s. He spent 2 years doing a lot of nothing before he went to school. He got a degree in religious studies and spent a good portion of his adult life studying demons. Johnny left home to move in with a group of friends at the age of 18 and never looked back. He never had any interest in college and instead opted to get a job at a local factory. He'd managed to make supervisor. I never forgave myself for inviting David into our home. I moved out at 18 to live with a friend of mine while we went to school. I managed to earn a degree. I moved out of state for my first real job. I met my husband there, through a friend. We've been happily together for nearly 6 years now. I've never seen David again. Joey didn't let his disability stop him. He graduated high school and is currently pursuing a degree in teaching. My parents never recovered from their guilt. My father turned to drinking and my mother receded into a shell. All of us, save for Joey, live out of state, so we really only see them twice a year during family get-togethers. They like to act happy, but I think we can all see past the facade. My relationship with Johnny was never repaired. He's made it clear that he'll never forgive me for bringing David into our lives. Oddly enough, neither Jim nor Joey blame me. Jack insists that it could have happened to anyone, and blaming anyone other than Lucifer himself is pointless. My parents have never spoken about who they blame. It's a topic they both avoid entirely.